On a scorching summer day in 1875, the town of Santa Fe, nestled in the heart of New Mexico territory, maintained its quiet dignity. Desert winds caressed the bell tower of Mission San Miguel, while sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor. The people living in this small frontier town followed rules as rigid as the harsh desert conditions they endured. Here, religion and tradition stood above all else. Even sinful thoughts could invoke God's wrath. And within this sanctity, no one knew that storms were brewing in Sister Magdalena's heart. That day, the dust cloud rising from the desert horizon didn't just herald the arrival of a stranger to town. That dust cloud also carried the return of a past that had been buried 5 years ago. A past that would shake the very foundations of faith and challenge the sacred vows that bound a woman's soul. Some say love is the greatest sin. Others believe it's the greatest salvation. But what happens when these two forces collide within the walls of a sacred place? What happens when a heart that has sworn itself to God finds itself torn between heaven and earth? This is the story of Sister Magdalena, a woman who would discover that some bonds are stronger than sacred vows, and some loves are worth risking everything for. The morning prayers had just concluded when Sister Magdalena first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. Standing by the tall windows of the mission's prayer hall, she watched as the small speck grew larger, moving steadily toward Santa Fe. In this remote corner of the territory, visitors were rare, and unexpected ones even rarer. "Sister Magdalena," came the gentle voice of Father Antonio behind her. "The children are waiting for their lessons?" She turned from the window, her dark habit rustling softly against the stone floor. "Of course, Father. I was just... The desert seems restless today." Father Antonio joined her at the window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 55, he had seen enough of the frontier to know when something was amiss. "A lone rider," he observed, squinting against the bright morning sun, "moving with purpose." Magdalena's heart skipped a beat, though she couldn't explain why. Something about the approaching figure stirred a memory she had worked 5 years to bury. "Perhaps someone in need of sanctuary," she suggested, her voice steadier than she felt. "Perhaps," Father Antonio agreed, but his tone carried a note of caution. In these parts, lone riders could mean trouble as easily as salvation. The children's laughter echoed from the courtyard, calling Magdalena back to her duties. She had been teaching the local children to read and write for 3 years now, finding peace in their innocent enthusiasm. It was one of the many ways she had learned to fill the void in her heart, to make her sacrifice meaningful. As she settled into the small classroom, arranging the few precious books they possessed, her mind wandered despite her efforts to focus. 5 years ago, she had fled to this mission in the dead of night, wearing nothing but her wedding dress and a heart full of terror. She had begged Father Antonio for sanctuary, and he had provided it without question, asking only that she commit herself fully to God's service. The transformation from Maria Elena Vasquez, daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the territory, to Sister Magdalena had been complete. She had taken her vows with genuine devotion, finding solace in prayer and service. The woman who had once danced at grand fiestas and dreamed of romantic love had died that night 5 years ago, or so she had convinced herself. "Buenos dias, Hermana Magdalena." The children's voices brought her back to the present as they filed into the classroom, their faces bright with curiosity and affection. "Buenos dias, mis niños," she replied, forcing a smile that grew genuine as she looked at their eager faces. "Today we'll continue reading about the adventures of Don Quixote." As she opened the worn book, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the mission walls. The children's attention immediately shifted toward the sound, and Magdalena felt her pulse quicken. She tried to continue reading, but the words seemed to blur on the page. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the mission gates. "Sister," called Brother Miguel from the courtyard, "we have a visitor, a man with an injured companion. Father Antonio requests your assistance." Magdalena's hands trembled slightly as she closed the book. As the mission's healer, she often tended to travelers and townspeople alike. It was another way she served God, using the knowledge of herbs and medicine her grandmother had taught her in childhood. "Children, practice writing your letters," she instructed, rising from her chair. "I'll return shortly." But as she walked toward the main hall, her steps grew heavier with each passing moment. There was something about this morning, something about that approaching rider, that filled her with a dread she couldn't name. The mission's heavy wooden doors stood open, allowing the desert heat to mingle with the cool stone interior. Father Antonio stood just inside, speaking with a tall figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight. The stranger's back was turned to her, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders. "Sister Magdalena," Father Antonio called, "this gentleman has brought an injured man who needs immediate attention." The stranger turned. Time stopped. The world tilted on its axis, and 5 years collapsed into nothing. Standing before her, dusty from travel but unmistakably real, was Joaquin Rivera. The man she had loved with every fiber of her being. The man she had fled from on their wedding night. The man she had convinced herself she would never see again. His dark eyes widened with recognition, and she saw her own shock mirrored in his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of 5 years and 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them like a chasm. "Maria," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "That name no longer exists," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "I am Sister Magdalena now." Father Antonio looked between them, his experienced eyes taking in the tension that suddenly filled the air. "You know each other?" "We ... Joaquin began, then stopped as if remembering where he was. "We knew each other long ago, Father, in another life." Magdalena forced herself to move, to remember her duties. "You mentioned an injured man?" "Yes," Joaquin said, his voice carefully controlled. "My partner was shot by bandits 2 days' ride from here. He's lost a lot of blood." Professional training took over, pushing aside the emotional turmoil. "Bring him to the infirmary immediately. Brother Miguel, please prepare clean water and bandages." As Joaquin carried his unconscious companion into the mission's small medical room, Magdalena caught glimpses of the man she remembered. He was older now, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his body leaner and more muscular. But his hands were still gentle as he laid his friend on the narrow bed, and his eyes still held that intensity that had once made her heart race. "What happened?" she asked, examining the wounded man's injuries, while carefully avoiding Joaquin's gaze. "Bandits hit our mail route 3 days out," he explained. "Tom here took a bullet meant for me. We've been riding hard to find help." Mail route. So he was a legitimate courier now, not the reckless young man who had once run with questionable companions. The thought brought an unexpected wave of relief. As she worked to clean and stitch the wound, she became acutely aware of Joaquin's presence beside her. He handed her supplies without being asked, anticipating her needs with an intimacy that spoke of their shared past. Their fingers brushed as he passed her the needle, and the contact sent electricity through her entire body. "He'll live," she finally announced, stepping back from the bed. "But he needs rest and time to heal." "Thank you," Joaquin said softly. I knew if anyone could save him, it would be you. You always had a gift for healing." The words hung between them, loaded with memory. She remembered the time she had tended a cut on his hand after a fall from his horse, how he had watched her face as she worked, how that moment had led to their first kiss. "Sister Magdalena," Father Antonio's voice interrupted from the doorway. "Perhaps our guest would like some food and water? It's a long journey from anywhere in this heat." "Of course," she replied quickly, grateful for the interruption. "I'll have Brother Miguel prepare something." As she moved toward the door, Joaquin caught her arm gently. The touch was like fire against her skin, even through the thick fabric of her habit. "Maria, Magdalena," he corrected himself. Could we speak, just for a moment?" She looked into his eyes and saw the same desperate longing she felt in her own heart. But she also saw something else, a pain that matched her own, a longing that had apparently survived 5 years of separation. "I don't think that would be wise," she whispered. "Please," he said, his voice breaking slightly. 5 years, Maria. 5 years I've searched for you. I need to know why. I need to understand." Father Antonio cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps our guest would benefit from some rest as well. The heat of the day is approaching, and travel in the desert sun can be taxing." The subtle message was clear. This conversation needed to happen away from curious ears and sacred spaces. There's a small garden behind the mission, Magdalena found herself saying, near the old olive tree, after Vespers tonight. Joaquin nodded, understanding. Thank you. As he followed Father Antonio toward the guest quarters, Magdalena sank into a chair beside the wounded man's bed. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing as if she had run for miles. 5 years of carefully constructed peace had been shattered in an instant. The woman she had tried so hard to bury was clawing her way back to the surface, and she didn't know if she had the strength to push her down again. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher, and the heat grew oppressive. But inside the cool stone walls of the mission, Sister Magdalena sat in the growing shadows, knowing that by evening, she would have to face the greatest test of faith she had ever encountered. The stranger had returned, and with him, all the desires she had sworn to abandon forever. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Magdalena attempted to return to her normal routines. She tried to focus on her duties, teaching the children, tending the mission's small garden, helping prepare the evening meal. But her mind kept drifting to the man now resting in the guest quarters. During the quiet hour before Vespers, she found herself in the mission's small library, pretending to organize the few dozen books they possessed. In reality, she was hiding, trying to gather the courage she would need for the conversation that awaited her after evening prayers. "Troubled waters run deep," came Father Antonio's gentle voice from behind her. She turned to find the priest standing in the doorway, his weathered face kind but knowing. "Father? In my 30 years of service, I've learned to recognize the signs of a soul in conflict," he said, settling into one of the worn wooden chairs. "That man, Joaquin, he's not merely someone from your past, is he?" Magdalena set down the book she had been holding, her hands trembling slightly. "No, Father, he was your intended husband?" The words hit her like a physical blow. She had never spoken of her past to anyone, not even in confession. The shame and confusion of that night 5 years ago had remained locked in her heart. "How did you know?" Father Antonio smiled sadly. "A priest learns to read faces, my child, and I've seen enough desperate brides flee to sanctuary to recognize the signs. You came to us on what should have been your wedding night, wearing a gown that cost more than most families see in a lifetime." Magdalena sank into the chair across from him, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I couldn't go through with it, Father. Not after what I discovered." "What did you discover?" The memory rushed back with painful clarity. 5 years melted away, and she was once again standing in the shadows outside the cantina in her father's hacienda, listening to conversations that shattered her world. "The night before our wedding," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I couldn't sleep. I was nervous, excited. I went to look for Joaquin, to steal a moment alone with him before the ceremony. I found him with his friends, drinking and celebrating." Father Antonio waited patiently, understanding that some confessions took time to unfold. They were talking about the marriage, about what it would mean. One of his friends joked about how Joaquin had played the long game perfectly, how marrying the richest man's daughter in the territory would set him up for life. They talked about my father's cattle, his land, his business connections, but never about me. The pain in her voice was still fresh after all these years. "And Joaquin, he laughed. He said that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, but that I was pretty enough to make the sacrifice bearable." Father Antonio's expression grew grave. "And so you fled." "I felt like such a fool," Magdalena continued, tears now flowing freely. "I had believed every word he spoke of love, every promise he made. I thought what we had was real, sacred, to discover it was all calculation, all strategy." "So you came to us seeking sanctuary from a loveless marriage." "I came seeking sanctuary from my own naivety," she corrected. "I thought if I devoted myself completely to God, I could purge myself of those foolish romantic dreams. I thought I could become someone new, someone stronger." Father Antonio was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in thought. "And now he's returned." "Now he's returned," she echoed. "And Father, seeing him again, all those feelings I thought I had conquered, have returned as well?" She nodded miserably. What kind of woman does that make me? What kind of nun questions her vows at the sight of a man who never truly loved her? It makes you human, Father Antonio said gently. Tell me, child, in these 5 years, have you served God faithfully? I've tried to. Have you helped the sick, taught the children, comforted the grieving? Yes, but have you found peace in prayer, solace in service? Most of the time, yes. Father Antonio leaned forward. Then you have lived a life of genuine devotion. But devotion born of pain and fear is different from devotion born of love and choice. His words confused her. I don't understand. When you came to us, you were running from something. That's not the same as running towards something. True religious calling comes from love of God, not fear of the world. The implications of his words were staggering. Are you questioning my vows? I'm saying that tonight, when you speak with this man, you need to listen not just to what he says, but to what your heart tells you. God's will isn't always found in the path that seems most righteous. Sometimes it's found in the path that requires the most courage. Before she could respond, the mission bell began to toll, calling the faithful to Vespers. Father Antonio rose, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Go to evening prayers, my child. Seek God's guidance. And remember, he made the heart as surely as he made the soul. Perhaps it's time you trusted both. As Vespers concluded and darkness settled over the desert, Magdalena made her way to the small garden behind the mission. The old olive tree stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its ancient branches providing shadows that had sheltered countless secrets over the years. Joaquin was already there, waiting beside the stone bench beneath the tree. He had cleaned up from his journey, and in the moonlight, he looked achingly familiar. The same strong jawline, the same dark eyes that had once made her believe in forever. Thank you for coming, he said softly as she approached. I shouldn't be here, she replied, but she sat on the bench nonetheless, careful to maintain distance between them. Probably not, he agreed, but I needed to see you, to talk to you. 5 years, Maria. Do you know what that's been like? My name is Sister Magdalena now. Your name is whatever you choose it to be, he said firmly, but you'll always be Maria to me, the woman I fell in love with, the woman I was going to marry. The words sparked anger in her chest. The woman you were going to use for her father's wealth, you mean? Joaquin's face went white in the moonlight. What? I heard you that night, Joaquin. I heard you talking with your friends about the long game, about how marrying me would set you up for life. I heard you say that love was a luxury you couldn't afford. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Oh God, Maria, no. You heard that conversation? Every word. Joaquin buried his face in his hands. You don't understand. You only heard part of it. I heard enough. No, he said firmly, looking up at her with desperate eyes. You heard me lying to my friends because I was too proud to admit the truth. She frowned. What truth? That I was terrified, he admitted. That the woman I loved was so far above my station that I couldn't believe she actually wanted to marry me. That I was convinced you would realize your mistake and call off the wedding. Magdalena felt the world shift slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying that I told my friends what I thought they wanted to hear. That I was some kind of calculating fortune hunter. Because admitting that I was desperately, completely in love with a woman who could have anyone, that would have made me look weak. He moved closer on the bench, his voice growing more passionate. Maria, I loved you so much it scared me. Your father's wealth, his position, those things meant nothing to me. I would have married you if you'd been a servant girl with nothing but the dress on her back. The words hit her like a physical blow. But you said... I said what I thought would protect my pride, and in doing so, I lost everything that actually mattered. His voice broke. I woke up the next morning ready to marry the woman of my dreams, only to find she had vanished in the night. Do you know what that did to me? Magdalena felt tears streaming down her face. You're lying. You have to be lying. I searched for you for 2 years, Joaquin continued. Every town, every mission, every convent. I rode hundreds of miles, spent every coin I had, neglected everything else in my life. When I finally gave up, I became a mail courier because it let me keep traveling, keep hoping that someday, somewhere, I'd find you. The garden spun around her. 5 years of carefully constructed truth was crumbling. But I heard you. You heard a scared young man trying to hide his vulnerability behind false bravado. And because of my stupidity, my pride, we both lost 5 years we could have spent together. She stood abruptly, pacing away from the bench. No, this can't be true. I've built my entire life on the belief that what we had was a lie. What we had was the most real thing in either of our lives, Joaquin said, standing as well. And it still is. The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Magdalena turned to face him, seeing in his eyes a truth that terrified her more than any lie ever could. It doesn't matter, she whispered. Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't matter. I've taken sacred vows, Joaquin. I belong to God now. Do you? He asked gently. Or do you belong to fear? Before she could answer, he continued. Father Antonio told me something today. He said that you've been here for 5 years, serving faithfully, but that he's never seen true joy in your service. He said you've been like a woman in mourning, going through the motions of faith without embracing its spirit. He had no right to. He said it because he cares about you, because he can see what I can see, that you're not really living, Maria. You're just existing, hiding. The truth of his words cut deep. She thought of her years at the mission, of the countless times she had knelt in prayer and felt nothing but emptiness, of the hollow satisfaction she took in her duties, the way she forced herself to find meaning in work that felt more like penance than calling. What are you asking of me? She whispered. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, God's plan for you isn't what you think it is. Maybe he brought me back into your life for a reason. Joaquin stepped closer, and she could smell the familiar scent of leather and sage that always clung to him. I'm asking you to remember what it felt like to be truly alive, to love and be loved without shame or fear. And if I say no, if I choose to honor my vows, pain flashed across his face, but his voice remained steady. Then I'll respect that choice and disappear from your life forever. But Maria, please, before you decide, remember who you were before fear made your choices for you. With those words, he turned and walked back toward the mission, leaving her alone beneath the ancient olive tree. The desert night was alive with sounds, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through sage, the soft hoot of an owl. But all Magdalena could hear was the thundering of her own heart. For 5 years, she had told herself that she had fled to save her soul. Tonight, she was beginning to wonder if she had actually fled to lose it. The next 3 days passed in a haze of confusion and inner turmoil. Magdalena threw herself into her duties with renewed intensity, as if constant activity could silence the questions that Joaquin's words had awakened. She rose before dawn for private prayers, spent extra hours with the children, and worked in the garden until her hands were raw from pulling weeds. But nothing could stop her from thinking about him. Joaquin remained at the mission while his companion recovered, helping with repairs around the grounds and generally making himself useful. True to his word, he maintained a respectful distance from Magdalena, but she felt his presence constantly. She would catch glimpses of him fixing a broken gate or hauling water, and each sight sent her heart racing. The worst part was how naturally he fit into the mission's rhythm. The children adored him, clustering around as he told stories of his travels. Brother Miguel appreciated his strong back and practical skills. Even Father Antonio seemed to enjoy their evening conversations about theology and philosophy. It was as if he belonged there, as if they all belonged together. On the 4th morning, Magdalena found herself alone in the chapel for private prayers before dawn. She knelt before the altar, trying to focus on her devotions, but her mind kept wandering. The questions that had tormented her since their conversation under the olive tree remained unanswered. Had she truly been called to religious life, or had she simply been running from disappointment? Was her devotion genuine, or was it built on a foundation of hurt and misunderstanding? And most terrifying of all, if Joaquin was telling the truth about his feelings, what did that mean for the vows she had taken? Struggling with morning prayers? She looked up to find Joaquin standing in the chapel doorway, silhouetted against the pre-dawn darkness. Her heart lurched at the sight of him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This is sacred space." "All space is sacred," he replied quietly, stepping into the chapel. "That's what you taught me, remember? You said God wasn't confined to buildings, that he could be found anywhere two people gathered in love." The memory hit her with painful clarity. They had been sitting by the river on her father's ranch, discussing the sermon they had heard that Sunday. She had been so young, so full of romantic notions about faith and love being intertwined. "That was a long time ago," she said, but didn't ask him to leave. Joaquin moved slowly down the aisle, his boots echoing softly on the stone floor. "Can I sit with you?" Just for a moment. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should refuse, should send him away, should call for Father Antonio. Instead, she found herself nodding. He settled onto the kneeler beside her, careful to maintain proper distance. For several minutes they knelt in silence, the chapel filled with nothing but the soft sounds of their breathing and the distant call of morning birds. "I used to imagine this," Joaquin said finally. "Imagine what?" "Praying beside you, being married, sharing morning devotions together, building a life where faith and love existed side by side." His words sent a sharp pain through her chest. "Don't. I know I don't have the right to say these things to you anymore," he continued. "I know you've chosen a different path. But Maria, I need you to know that losing you didn't just break my heart. It broke my faith too." She turned to look at him, seeing anguish etched in his features. "What do you mean?" "After you disappeared, I couldn't understand why God would give me such happiness only to snatch it away. I stopped praying, stopped believing that there was any plan or purpose to our suffering. For 2 years, I lived like a man without a soul. And now I think maybe I understand. Maybe God needed to teach us both something before we could find our way back to each other." "Joaquin, hear me out," he said urgently. "What if your time here wasn't meant to be permanent? What if it was meant to teach you about service, about putting others before yourself? What if it was preparing you to be the kind of partner who could build something meaningful with someone?" The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "You're asking me to believe that God wanted me to become a nun so I could learn to be a better wife? I'm asking you to consider that maybe your calling was never to serve God alone, but to serve him alongside someone who loves you? To build a family, raise children in faith, create a home where his love is lived out every day." The words painted a picture that made her soul ache with longing. She could see it so clearly. A simple house, children laughing in the yard, Sunday services where she and Joaquin sat together, a life of quiet faith and deep love. "Even if that were true," she whispered, "I've taken vows, sacred promises that can't simply be set aside because I've changed my mind." "Vows made under false pretenses," Joaquin countered. "You fled to religious life because you believed I had deceived you. But if that belief was wrong, then what? I just walk away from 5 years of service? Abandon the people who depend on me? You find a way to serve that doesn't require you to deny the deepest parts of yourself." Before she could respond, the chapel door opened and Brother Miguel entered, carrying supplies for morning mass. He stopped short when he saw them together, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Sister Magdalena? Senor Rivera? Is everything all right?" Magdalena rose quickly, smoothing her habit. "Yes, Brother Miguel. Senor Rivera was just... He had questions about our morning prayers." "I see," Brother Miguel said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe the explanation. "Father Antonio will be along shortly to prepare for Mass." "Of course," Joaquin said, standing as well. "I should return to my quarters. Thank you for the theological discussion, Sister Magdalena." As he left the chapel, their eyes met for one brief moment. In that glance, she saw all the words they hadn't been able to speak, all the possibilities that hung between them like morning mist. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Magdalena taught her classes, tended the sick, and helped prepare meals. But part of her mind remained in that chapel, replaying every word of their conversation. By evening, she felt stretched thin, as if she might snap from the tension. After Vespers, she found herself walking toward the garden again, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. Joaquin was there waiting, as she had somehow known he would be. I shouldn't keep coming here, she said as she approached the olive tree. But you do, he observed. Why? She sat on the stone bench, leaving space for him beside her. Because I need to understand. If what you're saying is true, if you really did love me, I did. I do. Then help me understand how we can bridge the gap between what was and what is. I'm not the same woman who fled 5 years ago, Joaquin. I've changed. So have I, he said, settling beside her. I'm not the proud, insecure boy who was too afraid to admit his feelings. I've learned the value of honesty, even when it makes you vulnerable. What kind of life could we have, she asked, voicing the question that had tormented her all day. I have no money, no dowry. The woman my father would have given you is gone. Joaquin laughed softly. Maria, I make my living carrying mail across the desert. I don't need a dowry. I need a partner, someone to share the joys and hardships of a simple life. And my vows? Speak to Father Antonio. Really speak to him. I think you'll find he's more understanding than you expect. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the desert night alive around them. Finally, Joaquin spoke again. There's something else you should know. About why I'm really here. Magdalena tensed. What do you mean? Tom's injury, it wasn't entirely an accident. I mean, the bandits were real, but I knew about this mail route. I knew it would bring me close to Santa Fe. I've been trying to work up the courage to come here for months. She stared at him. You planned this? I planned to deliver mail to Santa Fe, and maybe, if I was brave enough, ask around about a woman named Maria who might have joined a convent. Finding you at the first mission I tried, that was God's doing. The admission should have angered her, but instead it filled her with a strange warmth. You risked your life to find me. I risked my life because a life without you isn't worth living safely. The words hung between them, loaded with 5 years of longing and regret. Magdalena felt the last of her defenses crumbling. Joaquin, I'm scared. Of what? Of wanting this too much, of making another mistake, of choosing love over duty and discovering it was all an illusion again. He turned to face her fully, his eyes intense in the moonlight. Then don't choose based on fear. Don't choose based on duty. Choose based on truth. What truth? The truth of what you feel when you look at me. The truth of whether your heart feels more alive in this moment than it has in 5 years. The truth of whether the woman sitting beside me is more real than the one who kneels in that chapel every morning, going through the motions of a devotion she doesn't fully feel. His words stripped away all pretense, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. But for the first time in years, she also felt completely honest. The truth is, she whispered, that I've never stopped loving you. Even when I hated you, even when I tried to bury that love under layers of duty and prayer, it never died. And the truth is, he replied, that if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that love is real. Before she could lose her courage, before fear could reclaim her, Magdalena leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, filled with 5 years of suppressed longing. When they broke apart, both were trembling. I need time, she whispered against his lips. I need to pray, to think, to speak with Father Antonio. Take all the time you need, Joaquin replied. But Maria, don't take so much time that fear convinces you to choose the safe path over the true one. As they sat beneath the ancient olive tree, holding hands in the desert darkness, neither knew that Father Antonio stood at his window, looking out at the garden with a gentle smile. Some prayers, he reflected, were answered in ways that required great courage to accept. But courage, he had learned in his years of service, was often the truest expression of faith. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold when the sound of thundering hoofbeats shattered the peaceful silence of Santa Fe. Magdalena was in the garden, gathering herbs for the morning meal, when the first shouts reached her ears. Bandits! Bandits coming from the north! She dropped her basket and ran toward the mission's front courtyard, where she found chaos beginning to unfold. Townspeople were streaming through the gates, seeking sanctuary behind the mission's thick adobe walls. Children cried as their mothers clutched them close, while men shouted orders and tried to organize some kind of defense. How many? Father Antonio demanded of the rider who had brought the warning. Maybe 20, the man gasped, his horse lathered with sweat. The Delgado gang. They hit the bank in Taos yesterday, killed 2 people. Someone said they were heading this way. Magdalena's blood ran cold. The Delgado gang was notorious throughout the territory. Ruthless killers who showed no mercy to anyone who stood in their way. Santa Fe had no law enforcement to speak of, just a few men with hunting rifles and the courage to use them. Everyone inside the mission, Father Antonio commanded. Bar the doors and windows. We'll wait them out. But even as the priest spoke, Magdalena could see the fear in his eyes. The mission's walls were strong, but they weren't a fortress. If the bandits were determined to break in, they would find a way. Father, came Joaquin's voice from behind them. Magdalena turned to see him emerging from the guest quarters, strapping on his gun belt with practiced efficiency. How long since the warning came? Just now, Father Antonio replied, but they can't be far behind. Joaquin nodded grimly, checking his weapons. 20 men is too many to fight head-on, but maybe we can discourage them from staying long. Senor Rivera, the priest said urgently, this isn't your fight. You're a guest here, under our protection. With respect, Father, these people are under my protection too. And besides, his eyes found Magdalena's across the courtyard. I have reasons to fight for this place. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching riders echoed off the mission walls. Through the iron gates, they could see dust clouds rising in the distance, growing larger and closer with each passing second. Get everyone into the chapel, Joaquin ordered, his voice taking on the authority of a man accustomed to danger. It's the most defensible room. Father, do you have any men who can handle guns? A few, Father Antonio admitted. Brother Miguel served in the army before taking his vows, and some of the townsmen hunt. Good. Get them positioned at the windows. Keep the shots controlled. We want to make them think we have more firepower than we do. Magdalena found herself moving automatically, helping to herd the frightened townspeople toward the chapel. But her eyes kept returning to Joaquin as he organized the defense with calm competence. This was a side of him she had never seen before, the dangerous, capable man he had become during their years apart. Sister Magdalena, called Maria Santos, clutching her infant son to her chest. What's happening? Are we going to be safe? Yes, Magdalena heard herself saying, though she wasn't sure she believed it. We're going to be safe. Joaquin, Senor Rivera knows what he's doing. As the last of the civilians disappeared into the chapel, the sound of hoofbeats grew thunderous. Through the gates, they could now see individual riders, hard-faced men with weapons glinting in the morning sun. At their head rode a figure Magdalena recognized from wanted posters. Carlos Delgado himself, a man whose cruelty was legendary throughout the territory. Open the gates, Delgado shouted as his gang surrounded the mission. We know you're harboring money from the Taos Bank. Hand it over, and nobody has to die. Father Antonio stepped forward, his voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. This is a house of God, Senor. We harbor only those seeking sanctuary. Delgado's laugh was harsh and ugly. God's house or not, old man, we're coming in. You can make this easy or hard. Your choice. The choice has already been made, Joaquin called out, appearing at one of the mission's upper windows with his rifle trained on the bandit leader. You're not welcome here. Several of Delgado's men reached for their weapons, but their leader held up a hand. Well, well, a hero. How refreshing. His voice dripped with sarcasm. You really think you can hold us off, boy? I think, Joaquin replied calmly, that you're going to find this mission harder to crack than you expect. And I think the territorial militia is going to be very interested to hear that Carlos Delgado is in this area. It was a bluff. There was no militia within 50 miles, but Delgado's eyes narrowed with uncertainty. In the silence that followed, Magdalena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. You've got 1 minute to reconsider, Delgado finally said. After that, we start shooting, and we don't stop until everyone in there is dead. The bandit leader wheeled his horse around, barking orders to his men. They spread out around the mission's perimeter, taking cover behind rocks and sparse vegetation. The siege was about to begin. Magdalena found herself running toward the ladder that led to the upper level, driven by an impulse she couldn't name. She needed to be near Joaquin, needed to help somehow, even if it meant abandoning her place with the other civilians. "Maria, no!" Joaquin said sharply as she appeared at the window beside him. "Get back to the chapel where it's safe." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly, surprised by her own resolve. "If you're going to defend this place, you'll need someone to tend the wounded." "This isn't a game," he said, his voice rough with worry. "These men will kill anyone they see, including you. Then we'd better make sure they don't get that chance." Before he could argue further, the first shots rang out. Bullets whined off the adobe walls, sending chips of clay flying. Joaquin returned fire immediately, and Magdalena saw one of the bandits spin and fall from his horse. "Good shot," she breathed. "Stay low," he commanded, reloading with swift efficiency. "And if I fall, run. Don't try to help me. Just run." "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and meant it. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The mission's defenders were vastly outnumbered, but they had the advantage of position and cover. Brother Miguel proved to be an excellent marksman, and the few townsmen with rifles managed to keep the bandits pinned down behind inadequate shelter. But it was Joaquin who made the difference. He moved from window to window with deadly precision, his shots carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Watching him, Magdalena saw not the young man she had once known, but a seasoned fighter who had learned hard lessons in the years since their separation. "How many are left?" she asked during a brief lull in the shooting. "Maybe a dozen," Joaquin replied, quickly counting the figures still moving outside the walls. "But they're getting desperate. Delgado won't want to stay here much longer. Too much risk of real law enforcement showing up." As if summoned by his words, Delgado's voice boomed across the courtyard again. "Last chance. Send out the money and the pretty nun, and we might let the rest of you live." The words sent ice through Magdalena's veins. They wanted her specifically. But why? Then understanding dawned with horrible clarity. "They think I'm Maria Vasquez," she whispered, "my father's daughter. They think he's hidden money here." Joaquin's face went white. "Your father was one of the richest men in the territory. If they think he's stashed gold here, they'll never stop trying to get in," she finished. "Not as long as they think I can lead them to it." The situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. Delgado wasn't just looking for quick loot anymore. He thought he had stumbled onto the prize of a lifetime. "There's only one way to end this," Magdalena said, moving toward the ladder. Joaquin caught her arm. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to tell them the truth, that my father is dead, that there's no money here, that I'm nobody important anymore. They'll never believe you, and even if they did, men like Delgado don't leave witnesses." "Then what do you suggest?" Joaquin was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly racing. Then his expression hardened with resolve. "I'm going to do something stupid." "Joaquin, no." But he was already moving, stripping off his gun belt and handing it to her. "If this goes wrong, use these. Don't hesitate. Don't think about it. Just shoot anyone who tries to come through that door." "What are you planning?" Instead of answering, he called out the window. "Delgado, I want to make a deal." The shooting stopped abruptly. "I'm listening," the bandit leader shouted back. "Single combat," Joaquin yelled. "You and me, pistols at dawn. If I win, you and your men ride out of here and never come back. If you win, I'll tell you where the real treasure is hidden." Magdalena's heart stopped. "Joaquin, you can't—" "If I lose," he continued, ignoring her protests, "the information dies with me. But if I win, you get nothing and lose your best chance at the biggest score of your career." There was a long pause. Then Delgado's laughter echoed off the mission walls. "You're either very brave or very stupid, boy. But I like the odds. 1 hour in the courtyard. Just you and me." "Agreed." As Joaquin turned away from the window, Magdalena grabbed his arm. "Have you lost your mind? He's a killer, Joaquin. He's probably faster than anyone you've ever faced." "Maybe," he admitted, "but this is the only way to end it without more innocent people dying. And Maria, if something happens to me, I need you to know that these have been the best days of my life. Just being near you again, even like this." She silenced him with a fierce kiss, pouring all her fear and love and desperation into the contact. When they broke apart, both were shaking. "You're not going to die," she said fiercely. I won't let you. We just found each other again. I'm not losing you to some bandit's bullet. Maria, no, she said firmly. You're going to win this fight. You're going to send those men running, and then we're going to figure out what comes next. Together. The certainty in her voice seemed to give him strength. He nodded, then began checking his weapons with methodical care. But Magdalena could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his jaw. In 1 hour, the man she loved would face almost certain death. And there was nothing she could do but pray and hope that 5 years of separation hadn't been God's way of preparing them for another tragedy. Outside, Carlos Delgado was preparing for what he was sure would be an easy kill. He had no way of knowing that he was about to face a man fighting not just for his own life, but for a love that had survived 5 years of heartbreak and misunderstanding. Some fights, as Father Antonio would later reflect, were decided before the first shot was fired. And sometimes the strongest weapon a man could carry wasn't made of steel and powder. Sometimes it was made of hope. The hour passed like an eternity and an instant simultaneously. Magdalena found herself in the chapel with the other civilians, her hands clasped so tightly in prayer that her knuckles were white. Around her, mothers whispered comfort to frightened children, while men muttered among themselves about the madness of single combat. But Father Antonio knelt beside her, his weathered hands steady on his rosary. He's in God's hands now, the priest said softly, as are we all. Father, Magdalena whispered, I need to tell you something about Joaquin and me. I know, my child. She looked at him in surprise. You know, I've known since the moment he arrived, the way you looked at each other, the pain in both your eyes. It wasn't hard to deduce. Father Antonio's voice was gentle but firm. The question is, what do you intend to do about it? I don't know, she admitted. I've been so confused, so torn between duty and love. The word hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Is it wrong, Father? To want something so badly when I promised myself to God? Father Antonio was quiet for a long moment, his fingers moving over the worn beads of his rosary. Tell me, child, when you pray, what do you feel? The question surprised her. I try to feel devotion, peace. That's not what I asked. What do you actually feel? Magdalena's breath caught. Often, nothing. Emptiness, like I'm going through motions without meaning. And when you're with him? The answer came without hesitation. Alive, more alive than I've felt in 5 years. Then perhaps, Father Antonio said carefully, you've been serving the wrong altar. Before she could ask what he meant, the chapel door opened and Brother Miguel appeared. It's time, he said simply. The civilians were to remain in the chapel for safety, but Magdalena found her feet carrying her toward the door despite every rational thought. Father Antonio didn't try to stop her. Sister Magdalena, called Maria Santos, where are you going? To bear witness, she replied, not entirely sure what she meant. The mission's courtyard had been transformed into an arena. Delgado's remaining men formed a rough circle, their weapons drawn but lowered. Even bandits respected the ancient code of single combat. At the center of the space, 2 men faced each other across 20 paces of dusty ground. Carlos Delgado looked exactly like what he was, a killer who had survived countless gunfights through speed and ruthlessness. His hand rested casually near his pistol, and his scarred face wore a confident smirk. Joaquin stood opposite him, and Magdalena's heart clenched at the sight. He looked calm, centered, but she could see the tension in his posture. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting everyone he cared about, including her. Last chance to back down, boy, Delgado called out. I've killed better men than you. Then this should be easy for you, Joaquin replied evenly. Brother Miguel stepped between them, serving as the unofficial referee. The rules are simple, he announced. On my count of 3, you draw and fire. The last man standing wins. Magdalena found herself pressed against the chapel wall, Father Antonio beside her. Her entire world had narrowed to the 2 figures in the courtyard, in the space between them that would soon erupt in violence. 1. Time seemed to slow. She could see the sweat beading on Joaquin's forehead, the way his fingers flexed near his gun handle. 2. Delgado's smirk widened. He was enjoying this. confident in his superiority. Around the courtyard, his men shifted restlessly, eager to claim their prize once their leader inevitably won. 3. Both men moved simultaneously, their hands flashing to their weapons with practiced speed. But even as the motion began, Magdalena could see that something was wrong. Delgado was faster. His gun cleared leather a fraction of a second before Joaquin's. The bandit's shot rang out first, and Magdalena saw Joaquin stagger, a red stain beginning to spread across his shirt. But impossibly, miraculously, he stayed on his feet long enough to fire his own shot. Delgado's eyes widened in shock as Joaquin's bullet took him center mass. The bandit leader looked down at the spreading crimson on his chest, then back at his opponent with something approaching respect. "Well," he gasped, dropping to his knees, "I'll be damned." Then Carlos Delgado, terror of the frontier, toppled forward and lay still. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched taut as everyone processed what had just happened. Then Joaquin swayed and fell, and Magdalena was running before she consciously decided to move. "Joaquin!" She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands immediately going to the wound in his shoulder. The bullet had passed through the meat of his upper arm, painful and bloody, but not fatal. "Did I get him?" Joaquin asked weakly. "You got him," she confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "You magnificent, stupid, wonderful man. You got him." Around them, confusion reigned. Delgado's men were arguing among themselves, leaderless and uncertain. Some wanted to avenge their fallen leader. Others wanted to cut their losses and run. The standoff was rapidly deteriorating into chaos. "Listen to me," Father Antonio's voice boomed across the courtyard with unexpected authority. "Your leader is dead. The fight is over. Take his body and go before we decide to send for the territorial marshal." "Like hell," snarled one of the bandits, a thin man with a face like a rat. "We came here for money, and we ain't leaving without it." "There is no money," Magdalena shouted, still cradling Joaquin's head. "My father is dead, his fortune is gone, and I'm nobody important. You've been chasing a ghost." "You're lying," the bandit accused, raising his rifle. "Rich girl like you, there's got to be gold somewhere." The weapon swung toward her, and Magdalena saw death in the man's eyes. But before he could fire, another shot rang out. The bandit spun and fell, Brother Miguel's smoking rifle now trained on the remaining gang members. "Anyone else want to test their luck against God's house?" the former soldier asked mildly. That broke the spell. Faced with organized resistance and their leader dead, the surviving bandits grabbed Delgado's body and mounted up. Within minutes, the thunder of hoofbeats was fading into the distance, leaving only dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Is it over?" someone called from the chapel. "It's over," Father Antonio confirmed. "God be praised, it's over." But Magdalena barely heard the celebration beginning around her. All her attention was focused on the man in her arms, whose blood was soaking through her habit. "We need to get you inside," she said urgently. "That wound needs proper attention." "Maria," Joaquin said weakly, his hand finding hers. "I need to tell you something, in case ... "You're not dying," she said fiercely. "I won't let you." "In case I don't get another chance," he continued, "fighting for you, for this place, it was the most right thing I've ever done. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that." The words broke something inside her chest. All the confusion, all the internal debate, all the careful weighing of duty versus desire. It all crystallized into perfect clarity in that moment. She loved this man. Not the memory of who he had been, not the fantasy of who he might become, but the real, flawed, heroic man who had just risked everything to protect a place that mattered to her. The man who had spent 5 years searching for her. The man who had faced down a killer to keep her safe. "Joaquin," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "when you're healed, when this is all over, ask me again." "Ask you what?" "To marry you, to leave this place and build a life together. Ask me again, and this time I'll give you a different answer." His eyes widened. "Maria, are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As Brother Miguel and Father Antonio helped carry Joaquin into the mission's infirmary, Magdalena felt the last of her resistance crumble. She had spent 5 years trying to serve God by denying the deepest parts of herself. Now she understood that maybe, just maybe, she could serve him better by embracing them. The woman who had fled to the mission 5 years ago in fear and heartbreak was finally ready to step back into the world. Not as Maria Vasquez, daughter of privilege, and not as Sister Magdalena, bride of Christ, but as someone entirely new. Someone who had learned that love and faith didn't have to be enemies, and that sometimes the most sacred vow was the one you made to your own heart. 2 weeks later, Joaquin's wound had healed enough for him to move around the mission without assistance, though he still carried his left arm in a sling. The bullet had done no permanent damage, but Brother Miguel, who served as the mission's doctor, insisted on rest and careful movement. For Magdalena, those 2 weeks had been a time of profound transformation. She had spoken at length with Father Antonio about her decision, expecting resistance or disappointment. Instead, she found understanding and even relief. "I've watched you for 5 years," the priest had told her during one of their conversations. "You've served faithfully but never joyfully. There's a difference between penance and calling, my child. I think you finally discovered which yours truly was." The formal process of being released from her vows would take time and correspondence with church authorities, but Father Antonio assured her it could be done. Her vows had been taken under emotional duress, based on a fundamental misunderstanding, and she had never taken final orders. The church, he explained with gentle humor, preferred its nuns to be there by choice rather than by flight from heartbreak. Now, as the sun set over the desert on what would be her last night at Mission San Miguel, Magdalena found herself once again in the garden beneath the old olive tree. But this time, she wasn't wearing her nun's habit. Instead, she wore a simple blue dress that one of the townswomen had given her, the first secular clothing she had worn in 5 years. It felt strange, liberating, and terrifying all at once. "Having second thoughts?" Joaquin asked as he approached through the gathering dusk. His voice was gentle, without pressure or expectation. "Every minute," she admitted, "but not about you, about whether I'm strong enough to be the woman you need me to be." He settled beside her on the stone bench, careful not to jar his injured arm. "You faced down armed bandits to save my life. You stood up to one of the most feared killers in the territory. What could possibly make you think you're not strong enough?" "That was easy," she said with a rueful laugh. "That was just physical danger. This, building a life together, being a wife instead of a nun, figuring out how to love someone without losing myself in the process, that's terrifying." Joaquin was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the fading light. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about hearing me talk to my friends, about thinking I didn't really love you." "Joaquin, we've talked about this. I understand now that—" "No, let me finish," he said gently. "You were right to be angry, not about my feelings for you. Those were always real, but about my cowardice. I was so afraid of appearing weak that I hurt the person I love most. I let pride come between us." He turned to face her fully. "I want you to know that I've learned from that mistake. If we do this, if we build a life together, I promise you'll never have to wonder what I'm really thinking or feeling. No more false bravado. No more saying what I think others want to hear. Just truth, even when it's uncomfortable." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. "And I promise not to run away when things get difficult. No more hiding behind walls, literal or figurative. So we're both going to be completely honest, even when it's scary? Especially when it's scary." They sat together as the first stars appeared overhead, the desert air cooling around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound seemed to underscore the wildness of the life they were choosing. "Where will we go?" Magdalena asked finally. "I've been thinking about that," Joaquin replied. "There's a town called Silver Creek, about 100 miles north of here. It's growing fast. They need a school teacher, and they could use someone with medical knowledge too. The mail route runs right through it. You want to keep carrying mail? For now, until we can save enough to maybe buy some land, start a small ranch. Nothing grand, just enough to support a family." The word family sent a flutter through her chest. Children. She had taught the mission children for years, but the thought of raising her own, with Joaquin— "How many children do you want?" she found herself asking. His smile was visible even in the growing darkness. As many as God blesses us with, though I'd like to start with one and see how we do. I'd like that too. They fell silent again, both lost in visions of a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Finally, Joaquin spoke again. There's something else we need to talk about. Your father's ranch. Magdalena stiffened. What about it? It's still legally yours, Maria. Your father died without other heirs, and you never formally renounced your inheritance. That land, those cattle, it's worth a fortune. I don't want it, she said immediately. That life, that world, it nearly destroyed me. I want something real, something we build together. I understand that, Joaquin said carefully, but think about what we could do with those resources. The good we could accomplish. Schools for children who have none, medical care for families who can't afford it, help for people like us who are trying to build new lives. The idea had never occurred to her. She had been so focused on escaping her father's legacy that she hadn't considered using it for good. You really think we could make a difference? I think, he said, taking her hand, that together we could change lives, not by being wealthy and powerful, but by using wealth and power as tools to serve others. It was a vision that appealed to the part of her that had found genuine satisfaction in her work at the mission. Service, but by choice rather than obligation. Faith lived out through action rather than just prayer. It won't be easy, she warned. People will talk. The rich girl who became a nun and then ran off with a mail courier will be scandal from here to Santa Fe. Let them talk, Joaquin said with a grin. We'll give them something really worth gossiping about. As if summoned by their conversation, Father Antonio appeared in the garden, his footsteps soft on the pathways he had walked for 30 years. I hope I'm not intruding, he said gently. Never, Father, Magdalena replied, rising to embrace him. I was hoping to speak with you before we left tomorrow. Actually, that's why I'm here. The priest settled on a nearby stone, his expression thoughtful. I have a proposition for both of you. Joaquin and Magdalena exchanged glances. What kind of proposition? Joaquin asked. The church has been discussing the need for a new mission further north, near Silver Creek, Father Antonio began. A place to serve the growing population there, provide education and medical care, spiritual guidance. They've asked me to recommend someone to establish and run it. Understanding dawned on Magdalena's face. I'm suggesting that perhaps God has been preparing you both for this work. Joaquin, your knowledge of the territory and its people would be invaluable. Maria, your education and medical training could transform lives. And together, he smiled, together you could build something beautiful. But I'm not a priest, Joaquin protested. I can't run a mission. No, but you could run the practical side while Maria handles education and healing. It wouldn't be a traditional arrangement, but these are not traditional times. The church is learning to adapt. The possibility was overwhelming, to continue serving, but as partners rather than in solitude, to build something meaningful while also building their own life together. We'd be married? Magdalena asked. Of course. I could perform the ceremony myself before you leave, if you'd like. Consider it a wedding gift. Joaquin looked at Magdalena, his eyes questioning. This would change everything they had discussed, but it would also fulfill dreams she hadn't dared to voice. What do you think? He asked softly. I think, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, that maybe this is what I was really called to do. Not to serve God alone, but to serve Him with someone I love. To show that faith and love can work together instead of in opposition. Then we'll do it, Joaquin declared. Together. Father Antonio beamed. Excellent. I'll write to the church authorities immediately. In the meantime, he produced a small wrapped package from his robes, a wedding gift of sorts. Magdalena unwrapped it carefully, gasping when she saw what lay inside. It was a simple gold cross on a delicate chain, not the elaborate crucifix of her nun's habit, but something personal, intimate. It belonged to my mother, Father Antonio explained. She was a woman who believed that the greatest service to God was service to each other. I think she would approve of what you're doing. As Magdalena fastened the chain around her neck, She felt the last piece of her transformation fall into place. She was no longer Sister Magdalena, devoted to God in isolation. She was no longer Maria Vasquez, the frightened girl who had fled from love. She was someone new, a woman who had learned that sometimes the most sacred vows were the ones you made not to God alone, but to another human being, with God as witness. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of perfect weather for traveling. The mission's bells rang out as they had every morning for 50 years, but today they seemed to carry an extra note of celebration. In the small chapel where she had spent so many hours in conflicted prayer, Magdalena stood beside Joaquin in her simple blue dress, holding a bouquet of desert wildflowers. Father Antonio stood before them, his weathered face radiant with joy. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the sacred space, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but purpose." The ceremony was simple, attended by the mission's residents and the townspeople who had come to see the famous nun get married. Children threw flower petals, and even Brother Miguel smiled as he watched his former assistant take her vows of an entirely different nature. "Do you, Joaquin Rivera, take this woman to be your wife, to love and cherish, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Joaquin said firmly, his eyes never leaving her face. "And do you, Maria Elena Vasquez, take this man to be your husband, to love and cherish, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" She thought of the vows she had broken, the ones she had kept, and the new ones she was making. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by Almighty God and the Holy Catholic Church, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss that followed was soft, reverent, and full of promise. When they broke apart, the chapel erupted in celebration, the first wedding ceremony it had hosted in decades. As they walked down the aisle together, Magdalena caught sight of the stained glass windows that had provided so much beauty during her years of prayer. The colored light still fell in patterns across the stone floor, but now it seemed to be blessing their departure rather than illuminating her solitude. Outside, their wagon waited, loaded with their few possessions and wedding gifts from the community. Tom, Joaquin's partner, had recovered enough to travel and would accompany them north to their new life. "Ready?" Joaquin asked as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. Magdalena looked back at the mission one last time. 5 years ago, she had arrived here broken and afraid, seeking shelter from a world that had hurt her. Now she was leaving whole and hopeful, ready to embrace everything that world had to offer. "Ready," she said. As their wagon rolled through the mission gates and onto the desert road, the sun climbed higher into the endless blue sky. Behind them, the bells of Mission San Miguel rang a farewell. Ahead lay Silver Creek, their new mission, and a future built on the radical idea that love and faith could work together to change the world. Magdalena reached over and took her husband's hand, feeling the warm gold of her new wedding ring catch the sunlight. For the first time in 5 years, she was exactly where she belonged. Some journeys, she reflected, required you to get completely lost before you could find your way home. And sometimes home wasn't a place at all, but a person who loved you enough to wait while you figured out who you were meant to be. As the wagon crested a low hill and began the descent toward their new life, Magdalena smiled and squeezed Joaquin's hand. Behind them lay the past with all its pain and misunderstanding. Ahead lay the future, bright with possibility. And between them, in this perfect moment, lay love. Not the desperate, fearful love of youth, but the tested, chosen love of two people who had learned that the greatest adventures were the ones you shared. The desert stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and full of promise, and together they rode into it without fear. And so ends the story of Sister Magdalena and Joaquin Rivera, two souls who discovered that sometimes the most sacred vows are the ones we make not in solitude, but in partnership. Their tale reminds us that love and faith need not be enemies, that service to God can take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is required not to stay the course, but to change direction when we discover we've been walking the wrong path. In the years that followed, The mission they established near Silver Creek became known throughout the territory for its compassion and effectiveness. Children learned to read in its schoolhouse, the sick found healing in its infirmary, and countless travelers found sanctuary within its walls. But perhaps most importantly, it stood as proof that a life built on genuine love, love of God, love of each other, and love of service, could transform not just individual hearts, but entire communities. What do you think of Magdalena's choice? Was she right to leave her religious vows for earthly love, or should she have honored her commitment to the church? Could there be a middle path, as Father Antonio suggested, where faith and romance work together rather than in opposition? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this timeless conflict between duty and desire. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between the safe path and the true one? If you enjoyed this tale of forbidden love in the Wild West, there are many more stories where this came from. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest adventures into the heart of the American frontier. From tales of outlaws seeking redemption to stories of pioneers building new lives in harsh lands, we explore the human drama that shaped a nation. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if Magdalena and Joaquin's story touched your heart. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten tales of love, courage, and sacrifice to life. Until next time, remember that the greatest adventures are often found not in the destination, but in having the courage to begin the journey, especially when you're not traveling alone. Ride on and keep your hearts open to the unexpected.